Hey there, welcome to episode 134 of Mike's Collection. I'm Mike, and the part of my collection that I'm going to be talking about today is Masters of the Universe Origins Wave 4. So this is the fourth video in a series I've been doing where I'm reviewing each wave of the Masters of the Universe Origins figures. And if you've seen any of those three videos, you know what to expect here. Basically, I'm just going to go through each figure one at a time, kind of look at some of the details, some of the accessories, and compare it to like past versions of those characters. So like Masters Universe, the first toy line began when I was a kid back in 1982 and ran for a few years. It made a brief revival in the early 90s, came back pretty strong in 2002, and then probably the greatest iteration of Masters Universe yet was the 2008 relaunch, which was Masters of the Universe Classics. And now in 2020, 2021, we're seeing a new resurgence with the Origins line and new animated series and all kinds of cool stuff. So yeah, we're going to dive into these. But before I do, there is one aspect of these toys that I haven't talked about in the past three videos, and that is the packaging. In part because I've had some of those earlier waves for a while, and I opened them up a while ago. And now with some of these more recent waves, like Wave 4 that we're going to talk about today, and Wave 5 that I'm going to talk about in the next video, I've acquired those a little bit more recently, and it was only when I got those toys that I thought, you know what, I should maybe do a series of videos of these. So I started shooting little videos of what the toys look like in their packaging. So this video here, episode 4 or 134, you're going to see, as I show you each figure, I'll be able to show you just a little bit of what they look like in the packaging, and the artwork on the back of the packaging. So it's one of the things that's really great about this line, because there's probably a lot of collectors that aren't even opening these figures. You'll see there's some figures in my collection that I like to keep in their packaging and just kind of pin them to the wall as art. There's a lot of adult collectors that prefer to keep things in packaging, so having nice packaging is something that a lot of collectors really appreciate. So these figures here, they come in like very retro style packaging that look like the 80s Masters of the Universe figures that have this kind of exploding red rocks behind them. And you'll see that with these characters here like Stratos as I go through them. But I do just want to show you for the figures that were in Wave 1 and Wave 2. So there were 6 figures in Wave 1, 4 in Wave 2. I did, at the very least, I got some video, some still images of the packaging. So just before we dive into these ones here, I just want to show off what some of those other figures that I've already showed you in the past 3 videos, what they look like in the packaging, because the artwork really is impressive. I'm sorry I don't have the artist's name on hand. I know I've read it somewhere in the past, but they have hired, it looks to be the same artist. The art is pretty consistent across the board to do these original like paintings for the artwork, these original drawings. And it's just really great stuff. So you usually get like a unique drawing, if not on the front of the package. You usually get that with the deluxe figures. But across the back of the package, there's this nice banner that shows you this whole little like scene. It's really great stuff. And I'm throwing out the packaging, unfortunately, because I am opening up my Masters Universe Origins figures. I appreciate the packaging, but I just don't have the room to keep all of it. But someday, I imagine I could end up buying a book with all the artwork featured on these toys, because just maybe 3 years ago, I bought this very hefty, like $50, $60 hardcover that featured all of the artwork from the vintage toy line. And that was really great stuff too. So even though I don't really want to keep a bunch of loose cardboard laying around for these packaging, I would definitely consider buying it in an art book at some point in the future. So there you go. You've had a chance to look at some of the artwork from this lineup. So now let's dive in and take a look at the figures from Wave 4. So the first figure we're going to look at in Wave 4 of Masters of the Universe Origins is Hordak. So Hordak was the leader of a third faction that they introduced into Masters of the Universe back in the vintage toy line. So the line launched with Good versus Evil, He-Man versus Skeletor, and then they did the spin-off series, which was He-Man's sister She-Ra, and she needed a villain of her own, so she fought Hordak here and his army, which was called the Evil Horde. Now, when the toy lines came out, and I talked about this a little bit in my last video, they kind of marketed She-Ra a little differently, less like an action figure and more like a doll. All the female characters all had rooted hair that you could comb. They all came with combs, and they were packaged in nice, pretty pink packaging, kind of intended for girls. But then they had these monstrous, kind of villainous characters that were from the cartoon, and they probably knew that they wouldn't sell very well to girls, so they just integrated Hordak here and his evil horde into the He-Man toy line. And so they kind of shared packaging with He-Man, and so they were just kind of introduced as this third faction. Myself, like a lot of little boys, probably didn't have any She-Ra dolls to play with, so it wasn't like you could emulate the cartoon where you had He-Man fighting Skeletor and She-Ra fighting Hordak. If you had the evil horde, they were just now this third party, and it made for interesting playtime because you're so used to just good versus evil. You had Optimus Prime and Megatron, the Autobots versus the Decepticons, G.I. Joe versus Cobra. And it was kind of cool with He-Man that you had this third group with their own ambitions. They weren't, even though they were bad guys, they weren't friendly with Skeletor and his team. So I always thought that was kind of cool. I always liked the introduction of the Horde, and then later the Snake Men as a fourth faction. And it really made He-Man feel a little outnumbered, having to fight not just one arch enemy, but three. So yeah, Hordak was really cool. However, neither me nor my brother Doug had Hordak when we were kids. So there was no Hordak in our collection. We did have a couple other members of the Horde. I had both Mantenna and Leech. Mantenna was one of my all-time favorite figures. But yeah, we never had Hordak. So this figure here, I think, is pretty much like a perfect recreation of the vintage figure. Just looking at pictures online, this guy looks pretty spot on as far as the the sculpt goes and the coloring goes and the accessories go. Yeah, this guy looks a lot like the vintage figure. So let's take a closer look at him. So with all these videos I've been doing lately where I'm reviewing the different waves of Masters of the Universe Origins, I don't want to get too much into talking about all the articulation and stuff because it's pretty much the same on all the figures, so that would get a little repetitive. But since this is a new video, and chances are somebody might be watching this one for the first time and haven't watched my other videos, I do just quickly want to talk about the articulation on this guy. So vintage He-Man figures were kind of these little short, squatty figures. They didn't bend at the knees, they didn't bend at the wrist, they didn't bend at the elbow, the ankle. Basically all they did is their arms moved forward and backwards like so, their heads turned side to side like that, and they had a swivel waist where you could turn them at the waist and they would swing back and punch. And that was, and their legs, their legs were on an elastic, so their legs could do the splits and stuff, and that way they could sit on vehicles and ride beasts and stuff like that. But yeah, so with the Origins line, they take the aesthetic of the short, squatty, vintage figures, but they've added a bunch more articulation. So let me just move his accessories here for a sec. So you can see here he's got ankle articulation for the first time, so it can move side to side and forward and back, so lots of articulation there, lots of good poses. He's got a swivel there at the boot cut, bends at the knee. He's not on an elastic anymore, so he's got good movement there on the legs, so he can do forward, backward, and do the splits. He still turns at the waist, but it doesn't spring back like the vintage figures do, so you can actually pose him looking to the side if you want to. Their arms, instead of forward and back only, now they're on a ball joint so they can move out and up, so you get lots of good movement there. They've got elbows. They've got wrists, so the wrists turn, and wrists can also go. There's a joint, so they can go up and down. And the head, rather than just side to side, is on a ball joint, so it can do a 360, kind of look up and can look down. Hordak's a little limited than some of the other figures just because he's got this weird kind of harness around his head, so that does limit it a little bit for him. Hordak also has this cape attached to him, which might hinder the movement a little bit, but not too much. But you can see here this is soft rubber, and it is attached right to the sculpt there, so that's permanently attached. Now I think you can probably remove, like with all vintage figures, if you click these tabs you could probably pull, like this would split there and it would split there, and you could break it out, and it would never fit over his head, but these figures are meant to be interchangeable, so you can pop his head off there, and you could slide this whole armor off the top and swap out his parts. That's another feature of these figures that I talked about in some of the previous videos. You can pop their arms, their legs, their heads, all that stuff off really easily, and you can mix and match, which is pretty cool. Now, the one thing about this figure that is noticeably different from the vintage figure when you compare it to the pictures is the eyes. So with the head sculpt here, I would say what they did on the vintage figure, like this sculpt isn't an exact replica of the vintage one, but it's pretty close. But you see here how he's got these like red pupils on black eyes, and then he's got this sculpted ridge underneath the eye, or that surrounds the eye, and that's unpainted. On the vintage figure, where you see the black, that was all red, and then the ridge part was painted black. So overall that made his eyes look much bigger, and they just popped a lot more. So I'm not sure why they decided to go different here. His eyes look much smaller and beadier in this version, and I don't know which one I like more. I actually think he looks a little bit more evil like this. When you look at the vintage one, the eyes are so much bigger, it makes him look a little bit more cartoonier and a little friendlier. But yeah, the little beady eyes here make him seem a little creepier. But they did release another version of Hordak, a deluxe one, which we'll talk about in a future video, and they actually rectified that. I've got him right here, so I'll bring him in right quick. But you can see here the difference. This deluxe version of Hordak, has the eyes, fully red with the black ridge, and it's a really cool look. I like this one a lot, but it is a little cartoonier. Anyway, so there is Hordak. For accessories, he's got this little demon guy that this here's a little strap that I had to put around his wrist, and then you plug it in there so it pops through, so you could undo this. But it's meant to be this little goblin that sits on his wrist. And then he also has, as all members of the Horde always had, is his little crossbow. So this is kind of a weird feature. I always thought it was a little strange. But the crossbow clips into place there. So it just pushes it back ever so slightly and it locks on. And the idea being, I guess you could flick that and the thing pops forward. But it pops forward like with very minimal force, and it only moves forward maybe like a couple of millimeters. So for one, it doesn't really act like a crossbow. It doesn't fire anything. As a kid, I kind of, like Mantenna had one of these, and I kind of treated it like it was a bit of a battering ram. So he would go up to somebody and I'd release it and it would punch them. But this one, maybe I'm remembering it wrong. I feel my vintage one popped with a little bit more force and it could actually knock a figure over. But this one here, it's so slight that it doesn't really make a difference at all. But anyway, it's pretty accurate as far as the look goes. It's got this little dragon head that I think looks a lot like Bosk from Star Wars. So that head is on the front of his thing there, and it just clips right onto his wrist like so. So there is Origins Hordak. Now, as far as figure comparisons go, so I don't have the vintage figure to show you. Hordak was not featured in the 1990-91 relaunch of the New Adventures of He-Man. And in the 2002 reboot of Masters of the Universe, Hordak was alluded to in that series. And I think the intent was that Hordak was going to be featured as the main villain in Season 3. Season 1 focused on Skeletor. Season 2, King Hiss and the Snake Men. And like I said, they made references to the Horde, but we never really got there. I think they appeared in a flashback or two. But anyway, Hordak did not get a figure in the 2002 line. And that was a big bummer to me because I was really into the 2002 line. They were these kind of anime inspired, very dynamically posed, just cool upgrades to all the vintage figures. And I have quite a few of them. I have a lot of my favorite characters. Of course, I have He-Man Skeletor, but I got Merman, who's my favorite. I also got a new version of Buzz-Off and Stratos and Trapjaw. They all looked really cool. And it was disappointing that they never got to any of the members of the Horde. I was most wanting a Mantenna figure, but they didn't make any of them. However, they did eventually get to make the members of the Horde in little statues that were kind of consistent with the 2002 toy line. They called them Staction figures, which is a cross between statue and action figure. And so I was able to get a couple of the Staction figures. I got Mantenna, which is the one I wanted most, but I never even got Hordak. So had I got the Hordak Staction figure, I might have been content to have that in my collection, display it with my 2002 figures, and I don't know where my Masters of the Universe collection would have gone from there. But anyways, after the 2002 line fizzled out after a couple of years, the line was rebooted in 2008, 2009 with the Masters of the Universe Classics. And I've talked a lot about those in the past videos. I love the Masters of the Universe Classics figures. I think they are the best of all worlds. They are more detailed, they're bigger, great paint apps, great articulation, all that sort of stuff. But I was really reluctant to get into them at first. Partly because I was worried it would just fizzle out again, and I didn't really want to start another line of Masters of the Universe. I was still really liking my 2002 redesigns, that I felt like the classics were a step backwards. The fact that they were kind of looking more like the retro toys. And so yeah, I wasn't on board at first. So I've talked about how I missed out on He-Man, I missed out on Skeletor, I missed out on Beastman. What they were doing, Mattel was releasing one figure every month. And for probably the first year, I didn't pay much attention to it. I saw the figures, I thought they were cool, but I still would have rathered 2002 figures. I wish they had continued in that design. Anyway, I don't know if I ever would have pulled the trigger and ordered a figure online, one of the classics figures from Matty Collector, because that was the only way you could get them. However, one day I was in a local comic book shop here called Monsters Comic Lounge, and they had the classics version of Hordak secondhand. Somebody must have ordered it from Matty Collector and traded it in. So the figure was loose. He was just in a bag, and I can't remember what they were selling him for, maybe $20 or something. So the only reason I bought it is because I thought, well, I don't have Hordak in my 2002 collection, which I had displayed in my apartment at the time. So I thought, well, I'll get this classics Hordak and I'll display him with my 2002 figures, and hopefully he's, good enough. Anyway, so I got this. Here's the classics Hordak. And you can see here, he's got the little demon on his wrist, but it's much more detailed. It's actually a fully 3D sculpted figure. He's got this cool staff. He also has a crossbow, which is much more detailed with that dragon face. It's got a cooler paint job. Anyway, so when I got a hold of this Hordak, this was my very first classics figure. And boy, did it win me over. Once I saw it and had it in hand, I was like, wow, this guy is great. Like, I was reluctant to get back into this more vintage design figure, but yeah, once I got it in hand, I really saw the benefits of it. And I immediately tried to go back and recollect all of the classics figures that I missed out on. And I pretty much became like nearly a completist after this. Very rarely did I miss out on any figures after I get this Hordak. The few times that I did were because the figures sold out like immediately. They were produced in shorter numbers certain months for some reason. So I'm missing Roboto, and I'm missing Fisto, and I'm missing Whiplash, and a couple other key characters. But yeah, anyway, fell in love with the classics design. So here he is. You can see how similar these figures are in design anyway. The classics figure is obviously a lot more detailed. But as I've talked about in the previous videos, there's something appealing about the Origins figures in that they are so fun and affordable and brightly colored, durable, kind of intended for kids. Like, as great as this figure is, he's almost too great. He's an adult collectible. He's, very expensive on the secondary market. So I'd be very reluctant to, play with him. I don't like to handle him too much. I kind of just like to keep them on my shelf. But with these guys here, they're like $15 Canadian, probably $10 American. They're meant for durable play because they're intended for children. And yet at the same time, there's clearly, they must have been thinking about the adult collector, because it's so true to the vintage toys we grew up with, as opposed to, say, the new He-Man cartoon that they just showed a trailer for, that new CG cartoon that's coming out. Like, that's geared for kids, and I'm fine with that. But it's nothing that I'm interested in, and it probably won't be something a lot of adult collectors are interested in, because it's just so far removed from what we grew up with. But the Origins line kind of hits that perfect note of being somewhere between what we loved as kids the collector pieces that are classics that are really expensive for people to track down. So yeah, overall, I really love this Hordak, and I love the Origins line in general. So next up, we're going to take a look at Ninjor. Now, Ninjor was a villain. He was a member of Skeletor's team, one of his evil warriors. I can't remember exactly what year he was released, but I want to say it was maybe 87 or so. Me and my brother Doug, we collected these things. We were really into He-Man for the first year, like the initial line of figures and the second wave of figures. But as I mentioned in my first video where I talked about these things, our He-Man collection was very small when compared to other like toy collections we had when we were kids. We had a ton of G.I. Joe. Every Christmas for several years, I would get a big G.I. Joe vehicle, same as for my birthday. Collected Transformers for several years. And then there were other toy lines we were into, like the LJN wrestlers, Star Wars figures. I was into Battle Beasts. There was lots of different things. He-Man, we really loved He-Man, but it was for a relatively short period of time. So we didn't really strive to be completists probably by the time the third wave of He-Man figures had come out. So that's why I only had about 8 or 9 He-Man figures in my entire childhood collection, and my brother, probably just a few more than that. So yeah, neither of us had Ninjor. He's a cool character. Like, who doesn't like ninjas? Especially around that time in the 80s, there was lots of ninja, movies like American Ninja, and there was like ninja video games. Which is maybe almost the problem with Ninjor, is he seemed a little too generic. Like, he looks like a ninja. The one thing that maybe makes him not look like a ninja is these weird monster feet that he has. I don't know why Ninjor has weird 3-toed monster feet, because everything else about him kind of says standard human ninja, but that's what he had. So yeah, I always thought he was a cool looking figure. The vintage one looked pretty similar to this, but there was major difference in that you see here his mask. This is obviously sculpted right to his head. It is not removable. And his tunic here, it's removable in the same way that any other armor is. You kind of click these little tabs, pop his head off, and you can slide the whole thing off of him. But on the vintage figure, he had a cloth tunic. So his mask and tunic were all one piece of cloth, and it kind of hung a little looser on him, and you could remove it, and then you would see his unmasked face, which had like a little beard and a little mustache. So yeah, this one here doesn't have that. I'm kind of surprised they didn't give us an alternate head, maybe, to swap out. But yeah, this is what we got. So as far as accessories go, he's got all the same stuff he had in the vintage figure. He's got a sword. He's got nunchucks. Although, even though the nunchucks, if you look at the chain there, the links are separate pieces, so it can swing. But the vintage one had a real metal chain instead of this little plasticky chain. And then the last accessory he has, which I don't have him holding, is his crossbow. Just because I don't really like the look of it, I find it kind of big and awkward. So he could hold that in his other hand, or I could have him hold it in this hand. You see he's got storage on the back for his sword, but he doesn't really have anywhere to store the crossbow. So this thing here has just been in my spare parts bin ever since I got this guy a while back. So yeah, cool figure. I like the look of him a lot. Like I said, who doesn't love a ninja, especially like a black ninja? Very cool. The crest on his chest. I assume that's probably carried over from the vintage figure, but yeah, it's pretty cool too. I like it. So yeah, there's Ninjor. So as I mentioned, did not have the vintage one, and then Ninjor did not get a figure in the 2002 line. I don't know if he ever appeared in that cartoon. I don't think he did. I'm pretty sure he didn't get a Staction figure or anything. So after the initial release in the 80s, we didn't get an upgrade to Ninjor until the Masters of the Universe Classics line, in and around 2010, 2011, something like that. So I do have the Classics Ninjor, and he is great. So here is Classics Ninjor. Now you can see here he carries over all the same design elements. He's still got monstery feet, even though it's weird. He's still got his nunchucks. Although his nunchucks are just one solid sculpted chain, so they're not, in a way, it's not even as good as this guy's. But you get the point. He's got that same crest, a little more detailed here, and then a really great head sculpt. Lots of detail there in the eyes. Just a really cool figure. And then he's got a backpack that's got lots of storage here. So he's got a quiver of arrows, which makes sense. You'd think a guy walking around with a crossbow would have arrows with him. So he's got a quiver, and then his crossbow attaches to it, and then he still has storage for his sword as well. So very cool figure. And best of all, this guy actually did come with an alternate head with the beard and mustache. So if you wanted to display him without this head, you could display him unmasked, and that was really cool. So I like this guy a lot. And yeah, since I don't have any other figures to talk about, this is I think pretty much it for Ninjor. But yeah, I really dig both versions of this guy. So next up, we're going to take a look at Stratos. Now, I'm kind of just realizing, but this is kind of a reversal of Wave 3. So in the previous waves, the heroes and villains were pretty well balanced out. We had 3 heroes and 3 villains in Wave 1, and then in Wave 2 we had 2 heroes and 2 villains. But then Wave 3 was kind of lopsided because Merman was the only villain, but then you had Roboto, She-Ra, and Zodak, all heroic characters. So this one here kind of flips the script a little bit in that we've got 3 villains and only 1 hero. So Stratos is the only heroic character in Wave 4. So yeah, what can I say about Stratos? I really like Stratos. This was one of, if not the earliest Masters of the Universe figure I had. Like from the first wave, which me and Doug would have split when we were children, I had Merman and He-Man and Stratos, and then I think my brother had the rest. We didn't have Tila Evelyn, but he had Skeletor, Beastman, and whoever else there might have been. Anyway, so yeah, this guy's definitely one of the earliest figures I would have had. I would have got the original back in like 1982, and I love this guy. And I actually don't have the vintage figure here to show you for a comparison, and I honestly don't know why. I still have, quite a few vintage He-Man figures from my collection. Like I still have Merman, I still have Mantenna, I still have Buzz-Off. I even still have He-Man, which might seem obvious why I would keep He-Man, but he was like my least favorite character, to be honest. So I'm kind of surprised that I would have kept my He-Man and not my Stratos. And I don't typically lose things, so I don't know. I must have gotten rid of Stratos at some point, probably when I was like 12 or 13 years old, and I did a bit of a purge of my toy collection. But yeah, it is kind of shocking to me, because Stratos was my favorite heroic character until Buzz-Off came along, and then Buzz-Off knocked him down a peg. But yeah, just a really cool guy. I like the design, but it is very weird. So Stratos, as we learned from the cartoons, and I think probably the mini comics as well, this guy is from a race of like bird people that live in the sky. I think they are called the Avions, or maybe their city was called Avion. Anyway, there's some like bird-like history with this guy. But if you look at him, like, he's hairy. Like, he uses the hairy chest from like Beastman, so he's kind of almost ape-like. And then his feet, so he's got the little hairy feet, and then he's got these like no toes at all. It's almost like he's wearing socks. And you'd think like with a bird guy, it would make sense to give this guy the 3-toed feet as opposed to, say, Ninjor. But nope, he just had little sock feet. And then for a guy that's supposed to be a bird man, he has a jetpack, which allows him to fly, which seems kind of odd. You'd think of all characters that would need a jetpack, Stratos would need it the least. And then the wings, for a birdman, are just clip-on wings. You see, they're just attached to bracelets and they pop right off. And that was the same way in the vintage line. So you're like, is this guy a bird man, or is he an ape man who wishes he was a bird man? It's just strange. Like all the feather deco, like see, that's just attachable, and then he's got some feathery deco on his harness, but that's not attached to him either. There's really nothing about this guy himself that screams Birdman. Even his face. Like, what is going on here? If you look at that face, you know, they could have given him a beak or something if they wanted to, but if anything, that face, if not human, looks more monkey-like to me, with the beard and the shape of his nose. And then the helmet, I don't know what's going on with the helmet. He's a weird character. I don't know what they were thinking when they came up with this guy, but I guess I can't fault them for it because it worked on me. I loved this guy. I loved the way he looks. And I still do. I still think Stratos is great. So the vintage figure was available in two ways. You could either get him with a red harness and blue wings, or red wings and a blue harness. And I honestly don't remember which one I had. Overall, it doesn't really make any difference to me. I think both look equally good. But yeah, I can't remember which one I had. Anyway, so since I can't compare the vintage guy to you, the next one I can bring out here is the 2002 kind of reboot. And this guy here, like all of the 2002 figures, I really loved the redesign for Stratos. So here he is. So you can see he's just bigger, more detail, just really cool. So this one here, you can see I've got the reverse colors. So he's got the blue harness and the red wings. So this is based on the alternate look. As far as design go, he's still got the hairy arms, the hairy chest, the beard. So still very monkey-like. And for the first time, he's got toes. He's not wearing socks. So again, the feet are more monkey-like than anything else. A lot more cooler like bird design here in his loincloth. It's feathery. I like that they gave him the addition of these kind of shin guards here, and they seem to have like some sort of rocket booster built right into them. His wing design, these look much better than the little clip-on ones of the vintage figure and of the Origins figure. And they are articulated, so you can pose them out, so maybe that would help him to glide or something. So that makes some more sense. Also, for the first time, his arms could go out, so that would also make sense to help him glide. And then his backpack, his jetpack, you see he's got these little handles that come to his hands. I'm not really sure what the purpose of that is, but that's to maybe help guide him. The backpack, they also added these firing missiles. So he's just kind of souped up in every possible way. And I really love this figure. I think this was a great update. The head design is pretty much unchanged, although his nose looks a little bit more human this time around. So yeah, really cool. And then when it comes to the Classics figure, he was available in both color formats, but the one that I have is the red harness with the blue wings. So you can see here with the Classics figure, they stuck very close to the vintage figure for inspiration. So they don't have all these crazy elements from the 2002 design. Sometimes the Classics figures did retain some of the new elements that were added in 2002. But with this guy here, you can see his harness is nice and simple loincloth. He doesn't have the leg guards. His wings are right back to being these little clip-on wings that attach at his wrist. Jetpack, very simple, straightforward. So yeah, very simple design, very true to the original. And all these Stratoses look pretty similar. The newest one, I think it's pretty obvious he's the most brightly colored. His the gray used for the main sculpt of his body is substantially lighter than both of these figures. Since I don't have the vintage one here, it's hard for me to remember. I don't think he was this dark, but I don't think he was this light either, so he was somewhere in between. If anything, I think he leaned closer to the darker colors. But regardless, Stratos, just a really cool character, really cool figure. Really glad to have this update of him. And yeah, let's move on to the last guy. So the last figure we have to talk about in Wave 4 is Triclops. So Triclops is another one of Skeletor's evil warriors. And this guy was released fairly early on in the vintage line. So I always associate him as kind of being one of the main evil warriors. Like any of those characters released in the first two waves seemed important, and they were featured in like a lot more media, like cartoons and comics and stuff, than say characters that were released later in the wave. So yeah, Triclops always felt like an important character. My brother Doug had him when we were kids, so I don't have the vintage one in my collection, so I can't show you, the comparison, in hand. But the vintage figure, I think, did look a lot like this one. As I've said with all these Origins figures, they do a very good job of recreating the look of the vintage figure. Now, I always thought Triclops was kind of weird, partly because he came out around the same time as Trapjaw, and so I always associated them together. I think they might have even kind of palled around together in the cartoon. I always kind of imagined them as kind of a partnership. And Trapjaw is just so cool, and Triclops looks kind of goofy by comparison. At least I always felt he did. The gimmick on the vintage figure is the same as this one here. His name is Triclops, and you might be thinking, well, he's a Cyclops. He's only got one eye. But he has 3 eyes. So when you turn this thing on his head, he goes from his blue eye to his red eye to his really red eye. So I guess he's getting angrier as he goes. And if memory serves, I think each eye had a different power, maybe. Like one of them had a laser beam, and I don't know, maybe one of them could freeze you or something. I don't remember. But yeah, he had 3 eyes for a reason. It's not like they were all the same eye, and it wasn't really a matter of it just turning every time he got angrier. They spun for a reason, to give him different abilities. So yeah, the vintage figure was cool, but I just don't think he really stacked up when compared to his contemporaries, such as Merman, Beastman, Trapjaw. They were just all cool monstery characters, and I love monstery characters. And this guy here was just maybe a little goofy. And so that's how I always felt about him. Now this figure here, like I said, it recreates the vintage one really well. So if you liked him back then, you'll like this one. It's the same, except with all the increased articulation. He still has his green sword, rather long sword, which is the same accessory he had back in the day. So yeah, very cool. Now, since I didn't own the vintage one, the first Triclops I ever owned was from the 2002 relaunch, and I actually love this Triclops. So here's the 2002 redesign. And I don't know, whatever they did to him, I just thought it made him so much cooler. Like, they just made him seem like such a badass in that cartoon. And this toy, I just think looks so much better than this one. And when I say this one, I'm kind of referring to the vintage figure. This one just seemed like such a leap forward. Like, I just love the added design. Like, just the extra detail in the loincloth. The extra detail in the harness and the boots. The more cybernetic aspect of him here. So with the eye here, he goes from a red eye to a blue eye to a green eye. And again, they all were supposed to give him different abilities. I don't remember what. But yeah, I just really loved this design. I thought it was so cool. He's got a little action feature where if you push the button, his sword thrusts. Yeah. Anyway, really, really cool. And this was also the first time they introduced, he had like a little drone with him. It came on a little peg, kind of like the Orko figure, so it looked like it was floating. I couldn't find that right now. I'm not sure where it is. So he came with a little drone, and that seems to be something that they've integrated into Cyclops kind of going forward. I also really like the stance on this guy. Now, it was kind of a detriment to some of these figures that they were pre-posed, so some of them had really wide stances and stuff, and since you can't bend their knees and stuff, they were kind of stuck standing like that. But the way he was posed, it really made him look like he was battle ready, maybe kind of a martial artist or something. Really cool. Now, when it came to the Classics line, Triclops is one of those figures that I missed out on. I can't remember if it's because they released him really early on in the Classics line before I had started collecting, and they just never re-released him. Like, I was fortunate in that a lot of the toys I missed, they did re-releases. Like, sometimes around the holidays, they would say, like, we're cleaning out our warehouse, and we found old versions of, He-Man and Skeletor that we missed. And so I was able to buy these characters. But Triclops was one of the characters that just never saw a re-release. Or it's possible he might have been one of the figures that came out after I was buying these figures every month. But like I said, there was a couple of times when a figure just sold out like within a minute. They went on sale at noon in my time on the East Coast, and I'd log in, and at noon I would buy the figure. And yeah, sometimes they would sell out in a day or two. Sometimes it'd be a few hours. But on a couple of occasions, they sold out like before I could even get it in my cart. They would just be gone. And I'm not necessarily sure why that's the case. But yeah, I never had Classics Triclops. And even though I feel he's an important character, so it was a pretty glaring hole in my collection, I thought the Classics Triclops looked really goofy. Like his visor thing looked way oversized, and it just seemed to be a real step backwards from this cooler, sleeker design from 2002. So I wasn't that busted up about not having the Classics version, although it did suck not having a Triclops in my Classics collection. Fortunately, right before Classics kind of fizzled out, Super 7 did release a Filmation version of Triclops. So this is one based on the actual Filmation cartoon. And so I do have this figure in my Classics collection. Now this design is a lot simpler than even the vintage design, but that's because for the animation, they tried to make the designs nice and simple so they were easy to animate. So some of the things like extra colors and maybe extra frills on the armor, all that stuff was kind of pared down to keep things very simple for these guys. So I do like this figure, but I think this one looks better than the Classics one. But I would have rather got a updated version of the 2002 version. I just think that design is so much cooler. But yeah, all these figures are decent. But this figure here is what made me become a Triclops fan. And so even though this figure looks like the vintage one that I thought was kind of goofy when I was a kid, I've warmed up to it now, and I actually quite like it. Like, I prefer this design over, say, this design or the Classics design. Like, it's, I just really like the look of him. And I like to see that this character got his due a little bit in the Revelation cartoon that just came out on Netflix. It kind of showed that when Skeletor disappeared and there was a bit of a power vacuum, that unlike most of his other henchmen that just went into hiding, Triclops is the one that stepped up to fill that vacuum, and he tried to become like a leader of his own. And I really thought that was some cool character development for this guy, to show that this guy is maybe a little more clever than your average, schlubby beast man or trapjaw or whatever. So yeah, very cool. I like this guy a lot. And I think that about wraps up Wave 4. So that was my review of Masters of the Universe Origins Wave 4. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to hit the like button, the subscribe button, and please leave me comments below. I've had quite a few views on these videos in the last few days since I've been sharing them, but not a whole lot of comments. So, I would really appreciate hearing from some of you guys. What do you think of these figures? Do you think they're better than the vintage, better than the Classics? What's your favorite line? All that stuff. It's interesting to me, so please leave comments below. And I'll be back probably in a couple of days with my review of Wave 5. So I'll see you then. Ciao.